My name is Lawrence Sagasta from Boise, Idaho. This is my interpretive. For some students, their course of education is sometimes a dilemma for themselves. In some instances, students are pursuing a career, and their education based on that career goal is dictated by their parents, as opposed to pursuing a passionate goal for themselves. Life is not just about overcoming challenges. Literature and learning is not just about retention. The intertwining of both gives the opportunity of a person to build upon who they are and to create a unique individual whose ambition is to rise above and passionately pursue life's great experience. This particular interpretive is based on a movie named Dead Poets Society. There are a few characters that play an important role in this movie, one of which is Robin Williams, who is a professor of poetry, Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating is teaching in a private school for boys. Many of the boys are going to no doubt take on careers and base their core studies in the career that their parents have chosen, attorneys, doctors, whatever it might be. When in fact, they are very passionate about themes that they would like to pursue for themselves, yet will not because of how strong the family code is. In this particular scene, it's the beginning of the movie where Mr. Keating, the professor of poetry, has the boys open up their textbook, of which they're going to read about how to properly meter or calculate the importance or the value of poetry. During this scene, there's a few boys that take a part. Mr. O'Neill, for one, is a student who does have a very strong passion for acting, yet his parents are against it. Cameron, who is kind of the class clown, will follow suit with anything that is opposite to the school's culture. There's another individual, Cameron, who's kind of the class nerd and very straightforward, very straight-laced, and will do anything that is based on the curriculum of the school and or the class. So here's the beginning of this particular interpretive. It's in the classroom setting. Mr. Keating has just handed the boys their textbooks, and this is where we begin. Gentlemen, open your text to page 21 of the introduction. Mr. Perry, will you read the opening paragraph with a preface entitled Understanding Poetry? Neil Perry, Mr. Perry or Neil, begins. Understanding Poetry by Dr. J. Evans Pritchard, Ph.D. To fully understand poetry, you must be first fluent with its meter, rhyme, and figures of speech. Then two questions. 1. How artfully has the objective of the poem been rendered? And 2, how important is that objective? Question 1 rates a poem's perfection. Question 2 rates its importance. And once these questions have been answered, determining a poem's greatest becomes a relatively simple matter. Mr. Keating gets up from his desk and prepares to draw a chalkboard of the lines rating, or the meters of the lines to rate these poems. Neil continues, if the poem score for perfection is plotted along the horizontal of a graph and its importance is plotted along the vertical, then calculating the total area of the poem yields the measure of its greatness. Mr. Keating draws on the board. As he's doing so, the students are very carefully trying to copy that particular graph on their own notebooks for later reference. So all the students at this point are fully engaged in the teaching of poetry based upon the instruction of the book on how to properly gauge a poem. Neil continues, a sonnet by Byron may score high on the vertical, but only average on the horizontal. A Shakespearean sonnet, on the other hand, would score a high both horizontally and vertically, yielding a massive total area, thereby revealing the poem to be truly great. As you proceed through poetry in this book, practice this rating method. As your ability to evaluate poems in this matter grows, so will your enjoyment and understanding of poetry. Interesting. Poetry is only to be enjoyed because of its grading on a scale that is taught by a PhD instructor of poetry. This is where the true teaching begins by Mr. Keating. Neil sets down the book and takes off his glasses. The students sitting across from are discreetly trying to eat. They're all pretty much lost at this point. Keating turns away from the chalkboard and smiles because there's obviously some distraction. The boys are not interested in learning how to properly grade poems because that is not what poetry is about. Mr. Keating says, "Excrement. That's what I think of Mr. J. Pritchard, PhD. We're not laying pipe. We're talking about poetry." Cameron, who I mentioned was kind of the class nerd, looks down at his copied graph and notes and scribbles it out, as if to be questioning whether he was following the right instructions. I mean, how can you describe poetry like American Bandstand, Mr. Keating says. I like Byron. I like him a 42 perhaps. But can I dance to it? Charlie, who I mentioned as a class clown, suddenly becomes interested in the class because prior to that, he had no interest. The students look at the teacher like he's become mad. He says, "Go on and rip out the entire page of that note." You heard me. Rip it out. Rip it out. Charlie looks around at the others to see what they're doing. He looks down at his own book, which consists of drawings that are inappropriate. Mr. Keating says, "Rip it out." Charlie grabs a hold of his book and rips out the page. Holds it up as if to have a victory. He now suddenly has a different purpose to being in this class, which is going to mean more to him in his life than simply learning how to grade poetry. Mr. Keating continues, "Thank you, Mr. Dalton. Gentlemen, tell you what, don't just tear out this page. Tear out the entire introduction. I want it gone. History. Leave nothing of it. Rip it out. Leaving nothing of it. Rip it out. Rip. Be gone, Mr. J. Pritchard, PhD. Rip. Shred. Tear. Rip it out. I want to hear nothing but ripping of Mr. Pritchard." Meeks, another student, looks around reluctantly and finally begins tearing out pages. Keating sees Cameron still hesitating. Cameron is a student nerd. He says, "It's not a Bible. You're not going to hell for this. Go on. Make a clean tear. I want nothing left of it." Cameron turns around to Neil and to Neil and says, "What are we doing? This shouldn't be done." And Neil says, "Rip it. Rip it out." Neil makes Cameron turn it back. Mr. Keating says, "Rip it out. Rip it out." From outside of the hall, outside of the class in the hall, there's another professor, Mr. McAllister, who hears this noise and sees pages being ripped out. He bursts into the room. "What the hell is going on here?" says Mr. McAllister. The boys turn around in shock. Charlie stuffs the completed ripped out page in his mouth. Keating emerges from the back of his room with a waste paper basket. "I don't hear enough rips," says Mr. Keating. Mr. McAllister says, "Mr. Keating." "Yes, Mr. McAllister?" I'm sorry. I didn't know you were here." "I am." "Ah, so you are. Excuse me." Mr. McAllister backs out of the classroom and Keating says, "Keep ripping, gentlemen. This is a battle of war, and the casualties could be your hearts and your souls." Keating holds out the wastebasket. Charlie spits out the wad of paper. The class starts to laugh. Keating says, "Thank you, Mr. Dalton. Armies of academics going forward, measuring poetry. No, we will not have that here. No more of Mr. J. Pritchard. Now in my class, you will learn to think for yourselves again. No matter what anybody tells you, words and ideas can change the whole world. I see that look in Mr. Putt's eyes, like 19th century literature has nothing to do with me going on to business school or medical school, right? Or Mr. Hopkins, You may agree with him thinking, yes, we should simply study our Mr. Pritchard and learn our rhymes and rhythms and meter and go quietly about the business of achieving our ambitions. I have a little secret for you. Huddle up. The boys get up from their seats and gather around Mr. Keating as to have a team meeting, the quarterback in the center of the group and all the players looking in. Mr. Keating says, we don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of a human race. And the human race is filled with passion. Medicine, law, business, engineering. Those are all noble pursuits and necessary to sustain life. But poetry, beauty, romance, love are what we stay alive for. To quote from Mr. Whitman, "Oh me, oh life of the questions of the reoccurring, of endless trains of the faithless, of cities filled with the foolish. What good are mid these, oh me, oh life?" Answer, that you are here, that life exists, an identity, that the power play goes on, and you may contribute a verse. That the power play goes on, and you may contribute a verse. Gentlemen, what will your verse be?